What the heck happened to Nick Diaz? Back in the day, this guy was one of the toughest, most exciting fighters in all of MMA. From wild, bloody battles
picking up a bar with a jab, right hand,
to trash-talking opponents right in the middle of a fight.
Very skilled, and fantastic grappler.
I will fight at 185 pounds.
Unbelievable boxing, insane cardio. He's got all the things that could give a lot of guys problems.
Nick brought an energy that was unmatched. But if you are an MMA fan, you're probably asking yourself the same question we all are. Where did he disappear? How did he go from being one of the most feared and relentless fighters in the game to someone who went completely off the radar for years? That is what we will try to find out. Early career and rise to stardom. To understand Nick Diaz, you've got to start in Stockton, California. Now, Stockton's no easy place to grow up. It's gritty, it's tough, and for Nick, fighting wasn't just something he did, it was a part of surviving.
Growing up, or they had to deal with, you know, I'm gonna say, like, how many times you had a gun to your head, George? How many times someone put a gun to your head? How many of your best friends been shot through the chest with a 45?
From a young age, Nick gravitated toward martial arts. He found an outlet in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and boxing. And with that relentless work ethic, he started making waves in the combat sports world pretty quickly. Nick turned pro at just 18 years old and quickly made his way into the UFC by the time he was 20. Now think about that. A 20-year-old kid thrown into the lion's den with some of the best fighters on the planet. But Nick wasn't fazed. He didn't care who was standing across from him in that octagon. He was there to scrap, he was there to win. In 2004, Nick got his first real taste of the spotlight when he fought Robbie Lawler at UFC 47. At that time, Lawler was this powerhouse striker with a lot of hype behind him. But Nick didn't care. In the second round, Nick shocked everyone by knocking Lawler out with a flurry of punches, a TKO that put Nick Diaz on the map. From there, it was clear this kid from Stockton was someone to watch. But that was just the beginning. Nick didn't stop with the UFC. He went on to fight in Pride and Strikeforce, where he truly became a star.
Consider it a great honor to have been selected to fight in the Pride FC, and I'm feeling great, so I'm ready to fight.
It was in Strikeforce that Nick hit his stride, becoming their welterweight champion and defending his title 3 times. We're talking about some of the most epic fights in MMA history. Nick was relentless in the cage. He'd come forward with this non-stop pressure, throwing hundreds of punches, most of them to overwhelm his opponent. And then there was the Stockton slap. Yeah, Nick would literally slap his opponents in the middle of a fight, taunting them, showing them who was boss. And it wasn't just his fighting that made Nick stand out. His attitude, man, it was pure Diaz. He didn't care about playing nice with the UFC or being a company man. He did things his way. And that rebellious anti-authority mindset made him a cult hero among MMA fans. Diaz wasn't just fighting against his opponents. Sometimes it felt like he was fighting against the whole damn system. The breakthrough and rivalries. Nick's rise to fame wasn't without its challenges, and some of those challenges came in the form of some of the biggest names in the sport. One of the most anticipated fights in MMA history was Nick Diaz versus Georges St-Pierre. This rivalry was a long time in the making and had all of the ingredients for a blockbuster. GSP was the UFC's golden boy, a disciplined, calculated, technical fighter. Nick, on the other hand, he was the exact opposite. He was raw, gritty, and never shy about speaking his mind. That clash of personalities only added fuel to the fire. Their fight was supposed to go down at UFC 137, but Nick, in true Diaz fashion, no-showed the press conference, which led to him being pulled from the fight. That was classic Nick Diaz. He wasn't interested in playing by the rules or doing what the UFC expected. But eventually, the fight did happen at UFC 158 in 2013. And while GSP won by decision, the rivalry was one for the ages and added to the legend of the older Diaz brother. Nick gave GSP one of the toughest fights of his career, even if it didn't go his way in the end.
For my fight that I poisoned his IV. My rap was wrong, that I was on steroid.
But before the GSP fight, there was another war Nick fought. A war with BJ Penn. Penn was a former lightweight and welterweight champion, and people thought he'd be able to handle Nick. They were wrong. At UFC 137, Nick Diaz put on one of the most dominant performances of his career. He overwhelmed Penn with his pace, his volume, and his unrelenting pressure. By the end of the fight, Penn looked broken. And after the decision was read, BJ Penn did something that shocked everyone. He retired on the spot. That fight showed the world just how tough Nick Diaz was. BJ Penn was one of the greatest fighters of all time, and Nick made him question whether he still wanted to be in the game. The decline. But as Nick's star was rising, so were the problems. You see, Nick wasn't just fighting opponents in the cage. He was constantly at odds with the UFC and its president, Dana White. Nick had no love for the UFC management. He hated the way fighters were treated, and he wasn't shy about letting people know it. Media obligations? Nick couldn't care less. Press conferences? If he showed up, it was a surprise. It all came to a head after his fight with Carlos Condit in 2012, where Nick felt like he had gotten robbed in a decision. He threatened to retire right then and there, but it wasn't just about fight decisions. It was about feeling disrespected by the organization. Nick was frustrated that he wasn't getting the fights he felt he deserved, and it started to wear on him. And then there were the failed drug tests. Nick's love for marijuana was no secret, and it got him in trouble more than once. In 2007, after his fight with Takanori Gomi in Pride, Nick tested positive for weed, and the result of the fight was overturned. And that was just the beginning. In 2015, after his fight with Anderson Silva, Nick failed another drug test for marijuana, his third failure. The Nevada State Athletic Commission hit him with a 5-year suspension. Yeah, you heard that right. 5 years for weed. The MMA community was outraged. Fans and fighters alike rallied behind Nick, calling the punishment ridiculous and unfair. Even the UFC president Dana White spoke out against the severity of the suspension. After public outcry, the suspension was reduced to 18 months, but by then, the damage was done. Nick Diaz was out of the sport, and no one knew if he'd ever come back.
He was suspended for 5 years and got a $150,000 fine for marijuana. So you can completely take that out of context too, but that's his third offense.
The long hiatus. But the damage was already done. Even after the suspension was reduced to 18 months, we wouldn't see Nick inside the octagon for the next 6 years. So where was he, and what kept Nick Diaz away for so long? Well, it wasn't just the suspension. Over the years, Nick had made it pretty clear that fighting had taken a toll on him, both physically and mentally. There were times when he openly admitted he didn't enjoy fighting anymore. The suspension seemed to be the proverbial nail in the coffin, the final straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. Nick was never the type of fighter who was in love with the sport. He wasn't the guy talking about legacy or belts. For him, it was about putting food on the table, making a living. But when the sport started feeling like a grind, Nick checked out. He wasn't motivated by glory or titles. He was just surviving.
This isn't boxing, and I think we should get paid like this is boxing. I hear about people like, George getting paid way more than me, and then Manny Pacquiao and people, professional boxers getting paid that much money. I don't even know why I'm doing this anymore, because I feel like I get paid way too much money, but not enough.
And then there were rumors about his financial situation. Despite being a fan favorite, there were whispers that Nick wasn't doing as well as people thought. His long absences from the octagon meant fewer paydays, and with his love for the high life, partying, nightlife, it seemed like money might have been one of the reasons he decided to make a return later. On top of that, it didn't help that, despite being one of the most popular fighters of all time, Nick's relationship with the UFC was strained. He felt disrespected, undervalued, and at odds with how the promotion treated him. To Nick, the UFC wasn't just a place to fight. It was a place where he felt like he was constantly battling the system. The fighter pay, the politics, the media, it all added up, and it made Nick lose love for the game. Diaz's comeback to the UFC. But then again, despite how much he hated all the politics, all the drama, and all the media, Nick was a fighter at heart. And sooner or later, a fighter's gotta fight. Nick started getting that itch back again. And finally, in 2021, after nearly 6 years out of the octagon, Nick Diaz made his long-awaited return. When the announcement was made that he'd be rematching Robbie Lawler, fans were hyped. This was a fight 17 years in the making, and the nostalgia factor was off the charts. Fans of the old-school Nick Diaz were pumped to see him back in action. But when fight night came, something felt off. From the moment Nick walked out to the octagon, it was clear that this wasn't the same Diaz who went toe-to-toe with the best of the best. His movement was slower, his strikes lacked the same pop, and he didn't seem to have the same fire.
He's like an older guy now. And
how old though?
I think he's like 30. I don't know. How old is he?
38.
38?
Is he really?
But the thing is, I don't think you can just jump back in that easy after 6 years out of the sport. I think you'd probably need more time to prepare. I don't know.
He kind of got right.
Well, I don't know how much time he had to prepare and why they agreed to do a fight on short notice. Because I think it was only like 6 weeks notice, which I think is fine if you're, Michael Chandler.
By the third round, Nick had enough. He sat down, waved off the fight, and that was it. The Diaz who once prided himself on never quitting had done something no one expected. He quit mid-fight. The MMA world was stunned. Was this really the same Nick Diaz? Fans were left wondering if this was the end of an era. Did this fight tarnish his legacy? Or was it just a sad reflection of the toll years of fighting and being away from the sport had taken on his body and mind? His future. Even after that tough loss to Lawler, Nick Diaz hasn't completely shut the door on his career, and now as we head into UFC 310, the Stockton OG is gearing up for another return, this time against Vicente Luque, a dangerous and highly ranked welterweight known for his striking and submission game. Vicente Luque is no joke. The guy is a knockout artist, and his aggressive style might just bring out the best in Nick. But after such a long layoff, and that tough loss to Lawler, fans are wondering, what does Nick have left in the tank? Can he turn back the clock and give us one more classic Diaz performance? Or is this the end of the road for one of the most beloved fighters in MMA history? Where does Nick Diaz's story go from here? On one hand, you could argue that he never truly reached his full potential. The suspensions, the layoffs, the battles with the UFC, it all held him back from achieving what he could have. But on the other hand, Nick Diaz is already a legend. He has influenced generations of fighters, entertained millions of fans, and given us some of the most unforgettable moments in MMA history. With his return against Vicente Luque at UFC 310, Nick has one more chance to remind the world why he fell in love with this fighting style in the first place. So what do you think will happen? And who are you picking to win that fight? Let us know in the comments down below. It is safe to say the entire MMA fan base will be watching to see how this iconic career unfolds.